a lot of artists that use clay and glaze to express their own humanity and to get across concepts, not just the decorative, not just the aesthetic, but create real meaning with their ceramic sculpture. Bill Stewart has been an exciting ceramic artist, I think, because of the ways that he broke away from what was the tradition at the time. I actually first met him in the 1970s when I was a ceramics major, and we were being trained in wheel-thrown pottery, and there was a great respect for work coming from the tradition of Bernard Leach and Shoji Hamada and the wheel-thrown, beautiful, organic, natural ceramics. And then Bill Stewart came to do a demonstration in our ceramics class, and here was a guy who was using molded ceramics, low-fire clay, whiteware, decals, brightly colored glazes, and he was like breaking all the rules for what was considered fine art ceramics. So he was immediately engaging. His work was humorous, and he was kind of tapping into some of the things that were changing out in the West Coast, I think. There were artists like Peter Volkas in the late 50s and early 60s who really changed the field of ceramics. He was building large-scale sculptures, and he was working in an abstract expressionist mode, slamming on the clay, and it was very rough and expressive. This was totally out of the tradition of, the ritualized kind of vessel. So I think even though he may have started on a smaller scale, the initial seeds for what Stewart would do in his grander scale work comes from that core of work and Peter Volkas changing American ceramics. There were a number of other people over the years too, Paul Soldner, and then there was a movement in the 70s, kind of known as funk, and that was a group of artists like Patty Warshina, who were creating these funky kind of sculptures. They were figurative, they were brightly colored, they were meant to spoof things, often to comment on issues, critical issues, social issues, and I think that also was a stimulation. Bill was emerging at the same time and drawn to the same kinds of things. He's often said that his funky kind of imagery comes from a variety of sources. He's taps from his own experience and kind of childhood memories and toys and objects like that. A few things from popular culture, certain shapes that are reminiscent of various youthful memories. And then he's also been concerned with the environment and society and how we identify ourselves as individuals, even sexuality. They're all different aspects to his work and how he has addressed it, often with a sense of humor. I think his whole point is to kind of draw you into his work. He's very interested in kind of telling a story or giving you a puzzle that you need to unravel. So there are humorous aspects or color, although he did go through a period of doing just monochromatic works and it interweaves. Kind of get back to that. But he wants to draw you into the work and then leaves it to you to decipher it. There often can be more than one meaning to something. You're meant to free associate. It's kind of like a dream, a little bit like a rebus, but each element has more than one meaning. So Bill's work has changed over the years. When I first met him in the 70s, I helped to, in a demonstration of how to make a snake in ceramics. I mean, it was really funny. You rolled the clay and there were these different component parts that got put together, and it was just a lot of fun. He then eventually moved into experimenting with more decoration and more texture and more color, more components to the pieces put together. Sometimes there were pieces that came apart from the central kind of figure or base. He got into an anthropomorphism. Some of that comes from sources, say, like ancient Egyptian mythology, the jackal-headed gods, and different kinds of animal heads on human figures. So he's been interested in mythology. He also was inspired by other ancient cultures, pre-Columbian art, especially some of their ceramic vessels. In fact, there was a piece at the Albright Knox Art Gallery in Buffalo, across the street from where he went to school at Buffalo State College for his undergraduate degree, where the vessel had bird shapes and certain curves, so there were some wheel-thrown parts and some hand-built parts put together, and he pulled ideas from that entered into his work. He was also interested in ancient or quite old Mexican work, a sense of patterning on the surface, a kind of roughness to the glaze and the actual clay body. And often going back between something that was a vessel and something that was more of an iconic figurative piece that would serve a kind of religious or spiritual purpose in its creation. So those kinds of concerns also carried over into Bill's work, and how he has certain imagery that repeats itself. He merges through a kind of animism, the animal world with the human world. He's interested in masks and body adornment, the kind of patterning. There has been some wonderful photography of African dress and body adornment, especially for spiritual celebrations, and astonishing use of color, not only in the garments or the kind of vegetation that people wear, but the way they've painted themselves, and lots of different patterns, this kind of merging with the natural world, but in a highly ornamented way. That really appeals to him, and you see, he looks at this kind of thing as a kind of source material for ideas, and then he creates his own world, his own version, using our culture and the funny little elements of it, the animals that have some significance for him, or as elements that people would recognize, but even with the distortions that he has added to it. So he went from the decal work on white to a multicolored kind of body of work, and then he went monochromatic. He did a series of houses that were based on Mexican ceramics, and in 1982 he created a piece for the Birchfield Center, as it was named then, for a show called Sensational. This was an exhibit that we were doing that was for the seeing impaired. And he created this house out of clay, and he inscribed certain designs on the surface. So at most you could see a line or a little bit of dark rubbing in it, but it was essentially a red-bodied clay. And then there were some elements that were made out of wood and stained the same color. And he put wax lights on the roof, so that as somebody was touching these things, there was a snake coming out of the house, and it was made out of wood, and there were little ladders on the side. And so for a seeing person, you might assume that it was all clay, and it's only by touching it that you would find out that it was made out of different kinds of materials. So he's interested in playing with surface. He then returned to multicolored pieces, and they began getting bigger and bigger. And then he would go through periods of returning to the monochromatic. One of his most important pieces is a commission called The Council that he did for the Rochester International Airport around 1990. And the figures, there are 5 figures that are kind of humanoid shapes that have either a masked head or an animal head. They almost seem to be bound. They're mostly a matte black, maybe with a little bit of white line or terracotta patterning. And then there is a 6th figure, which is actually a stand with a bird on it. And these are congregated together, kind of like Rodin's Burghers of Calais, I would say. And they are congregated together in a granite pool of water. And in 2 sections on that granite, Bill selected excerpts from Native American texts. One is an excerpt from an Eskimo hunting song, and the other is an excerpt from Chief Seneca's treaty oration to the Congress in 1854. So he was tapping into some of the kind of imagery and sense of spirituality of Native Americans. The fact that the figures seem to be bound and contained, I think, also is a statement about the situation and what was to befall Native Americans in the treaties of the 19th century when they were herded to reservations. And it's a very evocative sculpture. At the same time, because it is kind of mysterious and black, and it incorporates these elements of masks and animals, it also is very attractive, and I've seen children playing around in the water and skipping around it, so it's very engaging at the same time. And that's really a strategy that Bill likes to use. He likes to draw you in and get you to look and hope that you'll look closer and then begin to think about what he's trying to get across in his message. He's very clever, very dedicated, also very, very funny, very approachable artist. There are some works that we have exhibited over the many years that we have known Bill Stewart. He was in an exhibition before I was at the Birchfield Penny Art Center called Language of Clay. And he was showing some sculptural pieces that were of his low-fire clay body with brightly colored glazes. And Joan Mondale, the wife of the vice president of the U.S. under the Carter administration, came to visit Buffalo and visited the exhibition. He got to meet her and talk about aesthetics and arts in America. It was a nice way of linking the regional artist with somebody who represented the whole nation. And he's done a number of he's been included in many different exhibitions and publications, and is really very widely known. His most recent work that I have seen, he operates in 2 different ways at the same time. He's done these incredibly huge ceramic pieces with all the bright color and even more mysterious, and with that manipulation, he's doing very little of the molded work, although those might be some details in the pieces, but he's hand building. And they take on some of that Volcus sense of touching the clay and molding the clay in a roughness. And at the same time, he's making these monochromatic pieces that seem to be anecdotes, or there's really an implied narrative to them. This also comes out of the strains of changes in art and in society. I think with a postmodern aesthetic, he's putting lots of elements together. It can be kind of confusing, but it's the way that we're all soaking in information nowadays. It's coming at us from all directions, and we have to try to make sense of it. So he's saying, well, take a look at this, and what do you make of it? And I think Thumper, which the Virtual Painting Arts Center acquired, Bill very generously donated it to our museum, is a fine example of that work. This is Thumper, Bill Stewart's wonderful sculpture. And I think the starting point, of course, is the title. He gives us these intriguing titles. So when you think of Thumper, what's the first thing that comes to mind? For me, I thought of, maybe because of my childhood, the film, the animated Disney film, Bambi. And there was a little rabbit in it called Thumper who thumped his foot, and they became close friends and dealt with all kinds of issues in growing up together. Well, there are rabbits in this piece, and the name Thumper. You have this kind of humanoid figure here who has two different color ears, rabbit ears. There are some hand-made and sculpted rabbits. There are painted rabbits around the painted, or the glazed on kind of mat that the figure is sitting on. There are molded rabbits as kind of toes on the foot of one of the feet of this Thumper figure that remind us of chocolate bunnies from Easter time. And so that rabbit theme is definitely following through. So I think that's one thing that kind of draws you in. But Thumper can mean a lot of different things. There's a heart here, the whole idea of the heartbeat as Thumper, and everything that it might imply, something about health, something about love. Definitely this gigantic red heart is drawing our attention into the sculpture. And there is a sense of timing and measuring it in his, up here it says ever ready, and the sense of battery. Now this could be a reference to pacemakers for all we know. I mean, there are all kinds of things that just get you thinking. Also, this figure, it has got a steering wheel. So you think about driving, and maybe you don't use the steering wheel, but just in doing a little Googling, I found out that Thumper is the nickname for a kind of motorcycle. I didn't know that. The motor makes a kind of thump, thump, thump sound, so it's a nickname. BMW and some other manufacturers make it. So there are all these different kinds of thumper. There's also a Bible thumper, somebody who is an evangelical kind of speaker, and you might say that the kind of message that Stewart is trying to give is trying to get out word on various subjects, and that's just one of the sets of little creatures here. You have your typical set of birds, sweet little birds that come from molds, little songbirds. You have the great big crow, who is, for Stewart at any rate, a symbol of hope. It's a very positive kind of symbol. Crows, I know, were very significant to the artist Charles Birchfield, for example, and we hear them in the springtime, and they're very invigorating. There are also little insects that he includes in all of his, in many of his composite sculptures, and we have all these etched designs and colors. There are polka dots and dinosaurs and other little figures and animals. There's that gigantic carrot. Kind of made me wonder if this is some kind of vehicle that is somehow fueled by this carrot. Very mysterious. There's a figure underneath, these bird-like creatures. There's a little dog on the side. And then almost as if there's some sort of strange magnetic attraction, there are little doll-like figures that just kind of stuck onto the head, as if this was in a funny way, a kind of black hole where all these elements are getting pulled in together, all detritus from our society. And it's on top of this stand with lots of little X's and colors and the configuration of a kind of mat or rug or some kind of fabric on the top of it. And even this kind of marking with the green X's or little crosses, you would see in ancient Mexican ceramics. So there's always a sense of tapping into history, presenting elements from our culture, our American culture. And there also is a sense, because of the scale and the way that he has worked the clay, of that substantial sense and the whole history of sculpture itself. The ancients used ceramics for their sculpture, particularly ancient Egyptians and other cultures. And for Stewart, he is one that I think is perhaps tired of the age-old argument, is it craft art or is it sculpture? I mean, the kind of scale that he's working on, the level of sophistication in his work, and even in, say, the huge sculptures that are at the International Airport in Rochester. It's sculpture, it's massive, it's telling a story, it's getting us to think. There are some people who like to categorize craft art as having a function. Well, this has a function on the level of metaphor. It gets us to think. It may be humorous, it may be colorful, but he wants us to think about our society, our place in it today, how we define ourselves, how we deal with the issues. How does humankind deal with the animal world? They can be kind of possessions, or we try to transform them into little creatures that we think we can control, but they are part of this overall environment that we're all a part of, and we need to think about how that is meshing. He likes to champion the lowly things, like the little tiny insects, the things that so many people want to ignore, but they inhabit the earth along with us. And there's even a sense of the celestial or spiritual with his use of wings, or maybe this is a way of putting bird wings on the figure. You're always kind of, your mind is just constantly clicking with different ideas and ways of reading this work, and I think that's his point. There's no single interpretation of a piece like Thumper. He wants you to come to it and then have it charge up your own brain and begin to think about how you relate to it and what it could mean to you within our society.